The rain had been threatening all evening, hovering in those heavy gray clouds that turned the autumn sky into something dark and uncertain. Emma Chen wiped down the last booth near the window of the Crossroads diner, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. Tired eyes, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of exhaustion that came from working double shifts 3 days in a row. It was nearly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and the diner sat on the edge of everything. To the east, the city lights glowed like distant promises. To the west, nothing but highway stretching into darkness and the kind of small towns that people passed through but never really saw. The Crossroads existed in that in-between space, serving truck drivers, travelers, and the occasional local who didn't want to drive into the city for a meal. "Table 6 needs a refill," called out Danny from behind the counter. At 62, with silver hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on his nose, Danny had owned the Crossroads for 30 years. He'd hired Emma 2 years ago when she'd walked in desperately needing work, and he'd never asked too many questions about why a girl with a college degree was waiting tables at a roadside diner. Emma grabbed the coffee pot and made her way to table 6, where old Joe sat with his usual crossword puzzle and lukewarm coffee. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday ordering the same thing, black coffee and apple pie, and never caused any trouble. "Thanks, sweetheart," Joe muttered, not looking up from his puzzle. 7 letters, to make amends. Starts with R. "Rectify," Emma said automatically, pouring his coffee with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Joe's pencil scratched against the paper. "Smart girl. Wasting your time here." Emma didn't respond. Everyone had an opinion about what she should be doing with her life, but none of them knew about the stack of bills on her kitchen table, the collection notices, or the debt that her father had left behind when he died 18 months ago. Nobody knew about the sleepless nights or the calculations she did constantly in her head. How many shifts to pay rent? How many to cover the minimum payment? How many until she could finally breathe? The bell above the door chimed, pulling Emma from her thoughts. She glanced up and her practiced smile froze. 3 men walked in, and they didn't belong here. Emma had worked at the Crossroads long enough to recognize the types who came through. Truckers had a certain weariness, a road-worn quality. Travelers moved with purpose or exhaustion. Locals had familiarity in their steps. These men had something else entirely, an energy that made the air feel heavier, made her instincts scream that something was different. The first man through the door was older, maybe 50, with iron-gray hair and an expensive coat that seemed out of place in a roadside diner. He moved like someone accustomed to people stepping aside for him. The second was younger, built like he spent serious time in a gym, with watchful eyes that scanned the entire diner in seconds. He positioned himself near the door almost automatically, but it was the third man who made Emma's breath catch. He couldn't have been older than 32 or 33, tall with dark hair, and the kind of face that would have been handsome if it weren't for the cold calculation in his dark eyes. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Emma made in 3 months, and he moved with a quiet confidence that suggested he'd never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Danny's face had gone pale behind the counter. Emma saw his hand tremble slightly as he set down the glass he'd been cleaning. The diner had 5 other customers besides old Joe. A young couple in booth 3 went silent. A businessman at the counter suddenly became very interested in his phone. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to quiet, as if the whole building was holding its breath. The man in the charcoal suit, he had to be the leader, let his gaze sweep across the diner with the casualness of someone taking inventory. His eyes passed over Emma without interest, dismissed the other customers, and then locked onto booth 7 in the far corner. Emma had barely noticed the man sitting there. He'd come in about an hour ago, ordered coffee he hadn't touched, and had been staring at his phone with the kind of intensity that suggested he was waiting for something. He was maybe 40, wearing a rumpled jacket, and now Emma could see the fear written clearly across his face. The 3 newcomers moved through the diner like they owned it. The older man and the younger one flanked either side while the man in the charcoal suit walked straight down the center aisle. His footsteps were measured, deliberate. Emma found herself frozen in place, coffee pot still in hand, watching something unfold that she didn't understand but knew was dangerous. The man in booth 7 stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Marco," he said, and his voice shook. "Listen, I can explain. Sit down, Tommy." The voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried absolute authority. Marco, that was apparently his name, gestured to the booth with one hand. "Sit down and let's talk like civilized people." Tommy sat. He didn't look like he had a choice. Marco slid into the booth across from him, his movements fluid and controlled. The older man remained standing a few feet away, hands clasped in front of him. The younger one stayed near the door, but Emma could see him watching everything, including her. "I'm going to need you to step back," Danny said quietly beside her. Emma jumped. She hadn't heard him approach. His hand was gentle but firm on her elbow, guiding her back toward the counter. "Just let them be." "Who are they?" Emma whispered, even though she thought she might already know. "You didn't grow up in this area without hearing stories, without knowing that certain families ran certain businesses, and those businesses weren't always legal. Nobody you want to know," Danny murmured. "Just stay back here and stay quiet." But Emma couldn't look away. From her position behind the counter, she had a clear view of booth 7. Marco sat with perfect posture, his hands folded on the table, while Tommy looked like he might be sick. "You've been avoiding our calls, Tommy." Marco's voice was conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "That's disrespectful. We had an agreement." I know, I just—" Tommy's words tumbled out fast, desperate. "I needed more time. The money's coming, I swear. I just need another week." "We've had this conversation before." Marco leaned back slightly, and somehow that casual movement felt more threatening than any aggressive gesture. 3 weeks ago, you needed another week. 2 weeks ago, you needed another week. At some point, Tommy, people start to think you're not serious about your commitments. Emma's heart was pounding. She'd seen enough movies, heard enough stories to know how these situations were supposed to end. The debt collector, the desperate man, the quiet threat that could turn into something terrible in an instant. Her hand tightened around the coffee pot. She should stay out of it. Danny was right. These weren't her people. This wasn't her business. She should just stand here quietly and let whatever was going to happen, happen. But she kept thinking about the bills on her kitchen table, about her own father, who'd gotten desperate enough to borrow money from the wrong people, about how that desperation had consumed him, how the stress had probably contributed to the heart condition that eventually ended his life, about how she'd found him slumped over those same bills, and how she'd inherited not just his debts but the crushing weight of choices made in desperation. "Please," Tommy was saying, and there were tears in his eyes now. "I have a family. I have kids. I made a mistake, I know I did, but please." Marco pulled something from inside his jacket, and Emma's body moved before her brain could catch up. "Don't do it!" The words came out louder than she'd intended, sharp and desperate in the quiet diner. Everyone turned to look at her, Danny with horror, the other customers with shock, the older man with cold appraisal, and Marco with something that might have been surprise. Emma's face burned. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd just yelled at a man who was clearly dangerous, who had 2 associates with him, who was in the middle of something that was absolutely none of her business. But she couldn't take it back now. Marco studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, there was no humor or kindness in it, but there was something almost like curiosity. "And why not?" he asked, his voice still that same quiet, controlled tone. Emma's mouth went dry. What was she supposed to say? She didn't even know what he was planning to do. She'd just assumed, but assumptions could get you hurt, could get you worse than hurt. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze, even though everything in her screamed to look away. "Whatever he owes you, there has to be another way. Violence doesn't fix anything. It just creates more problems, more pain. There has to be a better solution." The older man made a sound that might have been amusement or disdain. The younger one near the door shifted slightly, his attention now fully on Emma like she'd become a potential threat. But Marco just kept looking at her with that same enigmatic expression. "You think you know what I'm doing here?" "I think I know desperation when I see it," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "And I think I know that whatever happens in the next few minutes could destroy more than just one life. It could destroy families. Children could lose a father. A wife could lose a husband. And for what? Money? Pride? A point that needs to be made." "Emma, please." Danny tried to intervene, his voice tight with fear for her, but Marco held up a hand, silencing him without even looking in his direction. His eyes never left Emma's face. "You're brave," he said finally. "Stupid maybe, but brave. What's your name?" "Emma Chen." "Emma Chen," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "And you work here? At this diner?" "Yes." "How long?" Emma wasn't sure why she was answering, why she was engaging in this conversation with a man who was clearly not someone you engaged with casually. But something in his demeanor had shifted, just slightly. The cold calculation was still there, but now there was something else. Assessment, maybe. Evaluation. 2 years, she said. And in those 2 years, how many times have you seen people come through that door who were running from something? How many desperate people have you served coffee to, Emma Chen? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. A lot, I guess. And how many of them did you save? Emma didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, she didn't save any of them. She just served them coffee and took their orders and went about her business because what else could she do? She was just a waitress trying to survive her own problems. Marco seemed to read something in her silence. He turned his attention back to Tommy, who looked like he might pass out from fear and confusion. Then Marco finished the motion he'd started before Emma's outburst, pulling something from his inside jacket pocket. It was an envelope, plain, white, slightly thick. Emma watched, stunned, as Marco placed it on the table between them. "This is how I make things right," Marco said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Open it, Tommy." With shaking hands, Tommy picked up the envelope and pulled out its contents. Emma couldn't see exactly what was inside, but from Tommy's expression, confusion giving way to disbelief, it wasn't what anyone expected. "That's $5,000, Marco said calmly. "It covers what you owe, plus a little extra. Enough to get you to your sister's place in Ohio like you've been talking about. Enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere you won't be tempted to make the same mistakes." Tommy stared at the envelope like it might disappear. I don't understand. It's simple. Take the money, leave town, find legitimate work, take care of your family, and never," Marco's voice hardened just slightly on that word, "never get involved with people like us again. This is your one chance, Tommy. Take it." The silence in the diner was absolute. Emma felt like she'd stepped into an alternate reality where nothing made sense. This wasn't how these situations were supposed to go. The dangerous man wasn't supposed to hand out money and second chances. He was supposed to be the villain, and villains didn't do this. "I don't know what to say," Tommy whispered, tears now streaming freely down his face. Thank you, I swear, I'll never." "I know." Marco stood, adjusting his suit jacket with casual precision. "Because if I hear that you've gone back to your old habits, if I hear that you've borrowed money you can't pay back, if I hear that you've wasted this opportunity—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Go home, Tommy, pack your family, be gone by morning." Tommy nodded rapidly, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. He slid out of the booth, moving carefully past Marco and the older man, then practically ran for the door. The younger man by the entrance stepped aside to let him pass, and then Tommy was gone, the bell chiming in his wake. Marco turned to face Emma again. Up close she could see details she'd missed before. A small scar near his left eyebrow, the way his eyes weren't quite as cold as she'd first thought, the tiredness around them that suggested he didn't sleep well. "You asked why not," he said quietly, speaking only to her now. "You assumed I was here to hurt him, to frighten him, to make him pay in blood for his debts." Emma couldn't speak. She just nodded. "That's what everyone assumes," Marco continued, "because that's what people like me are supposed to do. That's the story everyone knows, the one that gets told over and over. The bad man doing bad things." He paused, and something flickered across his face. Frustration, maybe, or weariness. But those stories don't leave room for anything else. They don't leave room for people to change or to choose a different way. "Why?" Emma finally found her voice. "Why did you give him money instead of what everyone expected?" Marco's slight smile returned. "Because I'm trying to make things right in my own way. It's not always the way people expect, and it's not always easy, but it's the choice I'm making." He reached into his pocket again, and this time Emma didn't flinch. He pulled out a business card, plain and simple, with nothing but a phone number printed on it. He placed it on the counter between them. "If you ever need help, Emma Chen, call that number. You struck me as someone who understands what it means to be trapped by circumstances, to be fighting against debts and obligations that weren't entirely your fault. So if you need help, call. Consider it payment for your courage tonight." Emma stared at the card, not touching it. "I don't understand any of this." "You don't have to." Marco gestured to the older man and the younger one, and they moved toward the door with synchronized efficiency. Before he followed them, Marco turned back one last time. "But you were right about one thing. Violence doesn't fix anything. It just creates more problems, more pain. I learned that lesson the hard way." And then he was gone, the three men disappearing into the night as smoothly as they'd arrived. Through the window, Emma watched them climb into a black SUV and drive away, taillights disappearing into the darkness. The diner remained silent for a long moment, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then slowly, life began to resume. The couple in booth 3 started whispering urgently to each other. The businessman at the counter asked for his check in a shaky voice. Old Joe went back to his crossword puzzle like nothing had happened. Danny let out a long, shaky breath and put his hand on Emma's shoulder. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do," he said. "Marco Castellano doesn't usually come out here himself. You have any idea who he is?" Emma shook her head, though she was starting to piece it together from context and rumor. "His family's been in this area for 3 generations," Danny said quietly. "They run businesses. The kind you don't ask too many questions about. His father died 2 years ago and Marco took over everything. Word is he's been trying to change things, trying to make the family operations more legitimate. But old habits die hard, and the people who work for him don't all agree with his methods." Emma picked up the business card, turning it over in her hands. Just a number. Nothing else. No name, no address, no indication of what kind of help Marco Castellano might provide if she called. "Throw that away," Danny advised. "Whatever he's offering, it's not worth getting tangled up with people like that." But Emma slipped the card into her apron pocket. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she recognized something in Marco's eyes, that same trapped feeling she saw in her own mirror every morning. Maybe because someone had just walked into her diner and done something unexpected, something that suggested the world wasn't quite as simple as the stories made it seem. Or maybe because for the first time in 18 months, someone had looked at her and seen past the waitress uniform to the person underneath. Someone fighting, someone trying to survive. Someone who understood what it meant to be crushed under the weight of circumstances beyond your control. The rain finally started as Emma finished her shift, drops pattering against the windows of the Crossroads diner. She cleaned the booth where Tommy had sat, where Marco had placed an envelope full of second chances. She wiped down the spot where she'd stood and yelled, "Don't do it," at a man she didn't know, interrupting something she didn't understand. As she drove home that night, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the rain, Emma kept replaying the scene in her mind. Marco's words echoed in her head. "This is how I make things right." She didn't know what to make of any of it. She didn't know if Marco Castellano was truly trying to change or if tonight had been an aberration, a performance for reasons she couldn't fathom. She didn't know if keeping his card was smart or dangerous. But she knew one thing. Her life had just gotten more complicated. And somewhere in the darkness, driving away in a black SUV, Marco Castellano was probably thinking the same thing about his. 3 days had passed since the night Marco Castellano walked into the Crossroads diner, and Emma Chen hadn't stopped thinking about it. She told herself it was just the shock of the encounter, the adrenaline that had flooded her system when she'd shouted at a man who could have responded very differently. She told herself it was natural to replay unexpected events, to analyze them from every angle until they made sense. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that she couldn't reconcile the man she'd seen with the stories she'd heard. Emma had done her research. Late at night, unable to sleep, she'd typed Marco Castellano into her phone's search engine and found a scattered collection of information. There were a few local news articles from 2 years ago about his father's funeral. Antonio Castellano, described as a prominent local businessman, which was apparently code for something else entirely. There was a brief mention in a business journal about the Castellano family's legitimate holdings, a construction company, 2 restaurants in the city, and a logistics firm. But the real information came from the spaces between the words, from the things not said directly, the carefully neutral language in the articles, the way certain details were glossed over, the fact that Antonio Castellano's funeral had been attended by people whose names Emma recognized from other contexts, other rumors. Emma had grown up in this area. She knew how things worked even if she'd never been directly involved. She knew there were families who ran operations that existed in the gray spaces of legality, who had their hands in businesses both legitimate and otherwise. The Castellanos were one of those families. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. What Emma couldn't figure out was where Marco fit into that picture. Thursday morning came with crisp autumn air, and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Emma's apartment was a small one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old building that had seen better days. The radiator clanked and hissed. The water pressure was inconsistent. and her neighbors upstairs seemed to hold bowling tournaments at midnight. But it was hers, and she'd managed to keep it despite everything. She made coffee in the small kitchen, staring at the stack of bills on the counter that had become a permanent fixture in her life. Medical bills from her father's final hospital stay, the remaining balance on his personal loan, the one he'd taken out when his restaurant supply business had started failing, credit card statements with interest rates that should be illegal, collection notices that came with increasing frequency and increasingly threatening language. Emma had a system. She paid the minimum on everything, rotating which bill got priority each month based on which creditor was most aggressive. It was a juggling act, a constant calculation that left no room for error or unexpected expenses. One medical emergency, one car repair, one missed shift at work, and the whole precarious structure would collapse. She picked up one of the collection notices, this one from Apex Financial Services demanding $3,847.62 for her father's loan. The letter used phrases like final notice and legal action and immediate payment required. Emma had received 4 final notices from them in the past 6 months. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danny. Running late. Can you open this morning? Emma texted back her confirmation, finished her coffee, and got ready for work. She tried not to think about Marco Castellano's business card, still tucked in her wallet where she'd transferred it from her apron pocket. She tried not to wonder what would happen if she actually called that number. The Crossroads diner looked different in morning light. The harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look tired and worn at night were turned off, and natural sunlight streamed through the windows, making the red vinyl booths look almost cheerful. Emma went through her opening routine, starting the coffee, checking that the kitchen was stocked, setting up the register, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The morning rush at the Crossroads wasn't really a rush. A few regulars came in for breakfast, construction workers heading to job sites, early shift nurses from the hospital 20 miles away, seniors who liked the early bird special. Emma moved between tables with coffee pot in hand, taking orders, delivering food, making small talk that required no real thought. It was almost 10 o'clock when the bell above the door chimed, and Emma looked up to see Marco Castellano walking in. He was alone this time. No older man with the expensive coat, no watchful younger man positioning himself by the door. Just Marco, dressed more casually than before in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater under a black jacket. He looked younger somehow, less intimidating, though Emma noticed that the other customers still reacted to his presence, conversations dropping to whispers, sidelong glances, a subtle tension that rippled through the room. Marco's eyes found Emma immediately, and he headed straight for her section, sliding into the same booth where he'd sat with Tommy 3 nights ago. Emma took a breath, grabbed a menu and a coffee cup, and walked over with her professional smile fixed in place. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Coffee? Please?" Marco's voice was different in daylight, less cold, more tired. "And whatever you recommend for breakfast. I trust your judgment." Emma poured the coffee, set down the menu even though he'd said he didn't need it, and tried to ignore the way her hands wanted to shake. "The Western omelet is good. So is the stuffed French toast if you want something sweet. The omelet sounds perfect." Emma wrote down the order, acutely aware that Marco was watching her. Not in a threatening way exactly, but with that same assessing look he'd given her 3 nights ago, like he was trying to figure something out. "You came back," she said before she could stop herself. "I did." Marco wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and Emma noticed his knuckles were scarred, old wounds that had healed over long ago. "I wanted to see if you were okay. That took courage, what you did the other night. I wanted to make sure there weren't any repercussions." "Repercussions from who? You?" A slight smile touched Marco's lips. "Not from me, but word travels. People talk. I wanted to make sure no one gave you trouble for interfering in something that looked like my business." Emma glanced around the diner. The other customers were trying not to obviously stare, but she could feel their attention. "So far, the only trouble has been everyone asking me questions I can't answer." "What kind of questions?" "Mostly variations of 'Do you know who that was?' and 'What were you thinking?'" Emma surprised herself by being honest with him. Maybe it was the morning light making everything feel less dangerous, or maybe it was the tiredness in his eyes that made him seem more human. "Danny thinks I'm crazy. The breakfast regulars think I'm brave or stupid depending on who you ask." "And what do you think?" Emma considered the question. "I think I acted on instinct. I saw what I thought was about to happen and I couldn't just stand there. But now, She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. Now you're wondering if you misread the situation. Marco finished for her. If I was ever actually going to hurt Tommy. If your intervention changed anything or if I was always planning to do what I did. Were you? The question came out before Emma could reconsider it. Planning to help him, I mean. Marco took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I was going to do until you spoke up. I had the envelope with me. I'd already made the decision that giving Tommy a way out was better than the alternative, but I was still angry. Still frustrated that he'd put himself in that position, that he'd wasted chances before. Your words. They reminded me why I'd made that envelope in the first place. Emma didn't know what to say to that. She became aware that she'd been standing at his table much longer than was professional, that Danny had arrived and was watching them from behind the counter with a worried expression. I should put your order in, she said. Emma. Marco's voice stopped her as she turned to go. Can I ask you something? She turned back, waiting. Why did you speak up? You didn't know me. You didn't know Tommy. You didn't know what was really happening. Most people would have stayed silent, protected themselves. Why didn't you? Emma thought about her father, about the desperation that had consumed his final years, about the loan sharks who'd called the house at all hours, their voices pleasant, but their words carrying implicit threats, about finding him collapsed over the bills that had literally killed him with stress. Because I've seen what desperation does to people, she said quietly. I've seen how the fear of owing money, of not being able to pay, can destroy someone from the inside out. And I guess I thought, if there was even a chance I could prevent that from happening to someone else, I had to try. Something shifted in Marco's expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. You've dealt with this personally. It wasn't a question. But Emma nodded anyway. My father. He made some poor financial decisions when his business started failing. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, he was already... She stopped, not wanting to share more. Not with this man who was still essentially a stranger, regardless of how human he seemed in the morning light. I'm sorry, Marco said, and he sounded like he meant it. That's a heavy burden to carry. We all have our burdens. Yes, Marco agreed, his voice carrying a weight that suggested his own burdens were substantial. We do. Emma excused herself to put in his order, and she could feel Marco's eyes on her as she walked away. Danny pulled her aside as soon as she reached the counter. What's he doing here? Danny whispered urgently. Having breakfast, apparently. Emma, this isn't good. People like him don't just come back for the food. He wants something. Maybe he just wants breakfast. Emma countered, though she knew Danny was probably right. People like Marco Castellano didn't do anything without purpose. The morning continued with its usual rhythm, but Emma remained hyper-aware of Marco's presence in booth 7. He ate his omelet slowly, spent time on his phone, occasionally looking out the window at the passing traffic. He didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. Around 11, when the breakfast crowd had thinned out, Marco called Emma over again. Can you sit for a minute? He asked. If you're not too busy? Emma glanced at Danny, who shook his head slightly in warning, but curiosity won over caution, and she slid into the booth across from Marco, acutely aware that this was the same position Tommy had been in 3 nights ago. I want to explain something to you, Marco said, his hands wrapped around his third cup of coffee. Not because I owe you an explanation, but because I think you deserve one. What you saw the other night, that's not how things usually work in my world. It's how I'm trying to make them work. But it's complicated. You don't have to explain anything to me. I know, but I want to. Marco paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. My father ran the family business for 35 years. He had his own way of doing things, his own rules. When he died 2 years ago, I inherited all of it, the legitimate businesses, the less legitimate operations, the relationships, the obligations, the debts, and the people who expected me to do things exactly the way he did. Emma listened, saying nothing, letting him talk. The thing is, I watched my father for all those years. I watched how his methods created cycles. People borrowing money they couldn't pay back, getting desperate, making worse decisions, and then the enforcement would come and create more problems. It was efficient in its own way, but it was also destructive. It destroyed families. It destroyed lives. And I kept thinking there had to be a better way. So you started giving people money instead of collecting it. Sometimes, when it makes sense, when I think it'll actually help them break the cycle instead of just prolonging it. Marco's smile was rueful. My father's old associates think I'm weak. They think I'm wasting resources being soft. And maybe they're right in a purely business sense. But I can't keep doing things the old way and sleep at night. That's why you gave Tommy that envelope. Tommy was drowning. He'd borrowed money to pay off other debts, then borrowed more to pay that back, and it just kept spiraling. He was never going to dig himself out. He was just going to sink deeper until something broke. So I gave him a way out. One chance to start over, somewhere else, without that weight crushing him. Emma understood that more than Marco probably realized. She was living that same spiral, making the same calculations, feeling that same crushing weight every day. "And if he wastes the chance?" she asked. Marco's expression hardened slightly. "Then he'll face consequences." "I'm trying to be better, Emma, but I'm not naive. Some people need second chances. Some people need accountability. The trick is figuring out which is which." They sat in silence for a moment. The diner's ambient noise, the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, the sizzle from the kitchen, filling the space between them. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma finally asked. "Because I think you understand what it's like to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. And because—" Marco hesitated, and for the first time since Emma had met him, he looked uncertain. "I don't have many people I can talk to honestly. Most people in my life want something from me, or they're afraid of me, or they're judging every decision I make against what my father would have done. But you just spoke up because you thought it was right. No agenda, no fear of repercussions, just instinct and courage. That's rare in my world." Emma didn't know how to respond to that. Before she could figure it out, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She pulled it out and saw an email notification from Apex Financial Services, probably another threatening letter about the loan. But when she opened the email, her breath caught. "Dear Ms. Chen, this letter is to inform you that account 4782-9453-2847 has received a payment of $3,000. The current balance on this account is now $847.60. Please contact our office to arrange payment of the remaining balance." Emma stared at the screen, reading the words 3 times to make sure she understood them correctly. Someone had paid $3,000 toward her father's loan. Someone anonymous, because the payment details just said, "third-party payment," with no name attached. "Everything okay?" Marco asked, noticing her expression. Emma looked up at him, her mind racing. $3,000. The exact amount she'd been desperately trying to figure out how to pay. The amount that kept her awake at night doing impossible math. And it had appeared out of nowhere, right after Marco Castellano had walked back into her life. "Did you do this?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Marco's face was carefully neutral. "Do what?" "Don't." Emma's hand tightened on her phone. "Someone just paid a significant amount toward my father's loan, anonymously. And you show up here talking about how you help people by giving them chances, and I'm supposed to believe that's a coincidence? I never said I paid your debt, Emma. But you're not saying you didn't." Marco leaned back in the booth, his expression unreadable. "Would it matter? If someone paid some of your father's debt, does it matter who or why?" "Yes, it matters." Emma kept her voice low, aware of the other customers, but intensity bled through anyway. "Because I don't want to owe you anything. I don't want to be another Tommy, another person who's trapped by obligations they can't repay. I've spent 2 years trying to dig myself out of debt on my own terms, and I'm not about to trade one trap for another. It's not a trap if there are no strings attached. There are always strings attached. That's how this works, isn't it? You help people, they owe you, and eventually you call in those favors." Marco was quiet for a long moment, and Emma thought she saw something like hurt flash across his face before his expression closed off again. "Is that really what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think of you," Emma said honestly. 3 days ago you walked in here and I thought you were going to hurt someone. Instead you gave him money and a second chance. Now you're back, having breakfast, telling me about your complicated relationship with your father's legacy, and suddenly, some of my debt disappears. What am I supposed to think? You're supposed to think that maybe sometimes people do things because they want to help, not because they're building leverage. Marco stood, pulling out his wallet and placing 2 20s on the table, far more than his breakfast cost. "But I understand your skepticism. In your position, I'd feel the same way." He started to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Emma, I do understand what it's like to be crushed by obligations you inherited. My father left me with more than just businesses and operations. He left me with expectations, with relationships I never chose, with debts of honor and blood that I'll be paying off for the rest of my life. So when I see someone else struggling under that same kind of weight, yes, sometimes I try to help. Not to create obligation, but because I know what that weight feels like. Marco walked to the door, then turned back one final time. And just so we're clear, I didn't pay your debt, but I know people who know people, and sometimes information finds its way to those who might be in a position to help. What they choose to do with that information is up to them. He left before Emma could respond, the bell above the door chiming in his wake. Danny appeared at her elbow immediately. What was that about? I don't know, Emma said, staring at the email on her phone. $3,000. Not from Marco if she believed him, but because of Marco. Someone in his network. Someone who owed him favors or respected him enough to act on information he'd passed along. The implications made her head spin. On one hand, it was $3,000 she desperately needed. A significant chunk of crushing debt suddenly lifted. On the other hand, it meant she was now entangled with Marco Castellano in some way, whether she wanted to be or not. He said there were no strings, but Emma had learned the hard way that there were always strings. Always. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Emma went through the motions, taking orders, serving food, cleaning tables. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the morning's conversation again and again. That evening, after her shift ended, Emma sat in her car in the diner's parking lot and pulled out the business card Marco had given her 3 nights ago. Just a phone number, nothing else. She'd assumed it was for emergencies, for if she needed his particular kind of help. But now she wondered if it was something else, a way to stay in contact, to continue conversations that couldn't happen in a public diner with Danny watching nervously and customers whispering speculation. Emma had spent 2 years carefully building walls, keeping her struggles private, refusing help even when she desperately needed it. Self-sufficiency had become her religion, the belief that she could handle everything on her own if she just worked hard enough, planned carefully enough, sacrificed enough. But what if that wasn't strength? What if it was just stubbornness, or pride, or fear of being vulnerable? Her phone rang, making her jump. Unknown number. Emma considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. Hello? Ms. Chen? This is Robert Harrison from Apex Financial Services. The voice was professional, almost pleasant. I'm calling about your father's loan account. I wanted to personally follow up on the payment we received today. Oh, yes, I got the email. Excellent. Now I wanted to discuss your options for the remaining balance. Given the significant payment we just received, we're prepared to offer you a very favorable settlement arrangement. As Robert Harrison outlined payment plans and settlement options that had never been available to her before, when she was alone, desperate, and had no leverage, Emma realized something important. The payment hadn't just reduced her debt. It had changed her position, given her negotiating power, opened doors that had been firmly closed. Whoever had made that payment had understood that, had known exactly how the system worked and how to work it. Emma arranged a payment plan she could actually manage, ended the call, and sat in her car as the autumn afternoon faded into evening. The Crossroads Diner's neon sign flickered on, casting red and blue light across the parking lot. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I hope today brought you some relief. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry alone. You don't have to. Emma stared at the message for a long time. She should delete it, should ignore it, should maintain the careful distance she'd been trying to preserve. But instead, she found her fingers typing a response. Why are you doing this? The answer came quickly. Because someone should have done it for me, and because you had the courage to speak up when it mattered. That deserves something in return. I don't want to owe you anything. You don't. Consider it a gift. Or better yet, consider it what it is. Someone who understands using the resources they have to help someone who needs it. No strings, no obligations, just one person helping another. Emma wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that someone like Marco Castellano could make grand gestures without expecting anything in return. That help could come without hidden costs. But life had taught her to be suspicious of easy answers and generous gifts. Still, as she drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about what Marco had said about his father's legacy, about trying to break cycles, about choosing a different way even when everyone expected you to follow the old path. Maybe he was lying. Maybe this was all part of some larger game she didn't understand. Or maybe, and this possibility both frightened and intrigued her, Marco Castellano was exactly what he appeared to be. A man trying to be better than he was raised to be, struggling against expectations and obligations, looking for allies in unexpected places. Emma's apartment felt different when she walked in that evening. The stack of bills on her kitchen counter was still there, but it felt less suffocating. The collection notices were still urgent, but she now had a plan to address them. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, become more manageable. She made dinner, ate while standing at her small kitchen window, watching the city lights in the distance, and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she'd been a waitress serving coffee and avoiding complications. Now she was entangled, however loosely, with a man who existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal, who seemed to be fighting his own battles while trying to help her with hers. Emma pulled out her laptop and did more research, digging deeper into the Castellano family history. She found articles about Antonio Castellano's business empire, about his reputation as someone you didn't cross. She found obituaries that spoke in coded language about his community influence and local prominence. She found a few photos of a young Marco standing beside his father at various events, always in the background, always watching. But she also found newer articles from the past 2 years since Marco had taken over. A piece in the local business journal about the Castellano Construction Company, winning contracts through competitive bidding rather than intimidation. An announcement about the family's restaurants implementing new labor practices and benefits for workers. Small things maybe, but they suggested change, effort, intention. Emma thought about her father, about the choices he'd made when desperation had cornered him, about how he'd borrowed from the wrong people because the right people wouldn't lend to someone whose business was failing, about how the system was designed to keep people trapped, to extract maximum value from their desperation. What if Marco was trying to change that system from the inside? What if his efforts to give people second chances, to offer help instead of enforcement, were genuine attempts at reform? Or what if Emma was being naive, seeing what she wanted to see because the alternative, that she was now indebted to a dangerous man, was too frightening to accept? Her phone buzzed with another text from Marco. "I know you're overthinking this. I know you're probably researching me, trying to figure out my angle. That's smart, but sometimes things are simpler than they appear. Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow is another day." Emma typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on, "Good night, Marco." His reply was immediate. "Good night. And Emma, thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me why I'm doing this. For speaking up when you didn't have to. For being exactly who you are." Emma set her phone down and stared at it like it might suddenly make sense. None of this made sense. The dangerous man who gave second chances. The anonymous debt payment that came with no strings. The text messages that felt too personal, too honest, too human. But as she got ready for bed that night, Emma found herself thinking that maybe the world was more complicated than the simple stories suggested. Maybe people weren't just heroes or villains. Maybe they were all somewhere in between, trying their best with imperfect information and inherited burdens, looking for ways to be better than they were raised to be. Emma fell asleep with Marco's words echoing in her head. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we carry alone. You don't have to. For the first time in 2 years, she wondered if that might be true. 2 weeks had passed since Marco Castellano had walked back into Emma Chen's life, and in that time, their relationship had developed into something neither of them had quite expected. A cautious friendship built on mutual understanding and shared burdens. Marco had become a regular at the Crossroads Diner, stopping by 2 or 3 times a week, always sitting in booth 7, always during Emma's shifts. They talked about nothing important at first, just surface conversations about the weather, the news, the quality of Danny's apple pie. But gradually the conversations deepened, became more honest, revealed more about who they really were beneath the roles they played for the world. Emma had learned that Marco drank his coffee black with 2 sugars, that he had a degree in business administration from a state university, and that he'd wanted to be an architect before his father's death had pulled him into the family business. She'd learned that he read constantly, history mostly, biographies of people who'd tried to change systems from within, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. In return, Emma had shared pieces of her own story, how she'd been studying accounting before her father's death, how she'd dropped out to work full-time when the debts had become overwhelming, how she'd always wanted to open her own small business consulting firm, helping people like her father navigate financial challenges before they became crushing, how that dream felt impossibly distant now, buried under the weight of survival. The debt payment had been real, $3,000 that had given Emma breathing room for the first time in 2 years. She'd negotiated payment plans for the remaining balances, consolidated where she could, and for the first time could see a path forward that didn't involve drowning. But she still didn't know for certain if Marco had arranged it, and he wouldn't confirm or deny it. "Does it matter?" he'd asked when she'd pressed him. "Someone helped you. Accept the help and move forward." It was a Friday afternoon in late October when everything shifted. The diner was quiet, the lunch rush over, and the dinner crowd not yet arrived. Emma was refilling salt shakers when Marco walked in, and she immediately knew something was wrong. He moved differently, his shoulders tight with tension, his jaw clenched, his eyes carrying a hardness she hadn't seen since that first night. He slid into booth 7 without his usual greeting, and when Emma brought coffee, she noticed his knuckles were bruised. "What happened?" she asked quietly, setting down the cup. Marco stared at the coffee for a long moment before responding. "Had a meeting this morning. It didn't go well. Are you okay? Physically? Fine. Otherwise?" He gave a humorless laugh. "That's complicated." Emma glanced around the diner. Only 2 other customers, both absorbed in their phones. Danny was in the back office doing paperwork. She made a decision and slid into the booth across from Marco. "Talk to me," she said. Marco looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You don't want to hear about my problems, Emma." "Maybe not, but I'm offering anyway." She kept her voice gentle but firm. "You've listened to me talk about my struggles. Fair is fair." Something in his expression softened. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and Emma noticed they were shaking slightly. Adrenaline, probably, or anger, or both. "Vincent," Marco said finally. "My father's former right-hand man. He's been with the family for 25 years, since before I was born. This morning he told me I'm destroying everything my father built, that I'm weak, that the organization is losing respect because I'm trying to change how we operate." "What did you say?" "I told him that respect built on fear isn't real respect, that my father's methods created enemies and cycles that never ended, that I'm not interested in running the same operation he ran." Marco's voice was controlled, but Emma could hear the frustration beneath it. "He said I'm naive, that the world doesn't work the way I want it to, that people like us don't get to choose to be better. We are what we are, and pretending otherwise is dangerous." Emma absorbed this, thinking about what she knew of Marco's situation. "And the bruised knuckles?" "He got aggressive," I responded. "Nothing serious, but—" Marco flexed his fingers, wincing slightly. "It's a problem. Vincent has influence, relationships with people who preferred my father's way of doing things. If he decides to actively work against me, it could cause real issues." "Can you fire him?" "It's not that simple. He knows too much, has too many connections. Cutting him loose could be more dangerous than keeping him close." Marco met her eyes. "This is what I'm dealing with, Emma. Every day trying to change things while fighting against people who have more experience, more ruthlessness, more willingness to do whatever it takes. Sometimes I wonder if Vincent's right, if I'm being naive, if change is even possible." Emma thought about her own struggles, about how many times she'd wondered if digging out of debt was possible, if she'd ever escape the cycle her father had left her in. "Being naive and being hopeful are different things," she said carefully. "Naive means you don't understand the obstacles. Hopeful means you understand them but believe you can overcome them anyway. Which one are you?" Marco considered this. "I want to be hopeful, but some days the obstacles feel overwhelming." "Welcome to being human," Emma said with a slight smile. "That's what hope feels like. It's not easy confidence. It's choosing to believe in possibility even when everything suggests you should give up. Is that what you do? With your debts, your situation?" "Every single day. Some days I believe I'll get out from under it all. Other days I just focus on making it through the shift without breaking down. But I keep going because the alternative is giving up, and I've seen what giving up looks like." She paused. "My father gave up. Near the end he stopped fighting, stopped believing things could get better. That's what killed him as much as the heart condition. He lost hope." Marco's expression was intent, absorbing her words. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating to witness." "It was, but it also taught me something important, that hope is a choice. It's not something that just exists or doesn't exist. It's something you have to actively choose, every day, sometimes every hour." Emma surprised herself with how honest she was being. "So when you ask if you're being naive for trying to change things, I think the better question is, are you choosing hope? Because if you are, that's not naive, that's brave." They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon light streaming through the diner windows, casting long shadows across the worn tabletops. "Tell me about your father," Emma said suddenly. "Not the public version, not the businessman version. Tell me who he really was." Marco looked startled by the question. Why? Because I think you need to talk about it. And because if you're fighting against his legacy, it might help to remember that he was a person, not just a set of expectations. Marco was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. Then slowly he began to speak. My father was complicated. He could be generous. He paid for neighborhood kids to go to college, made sure elderly residents had their heat paid in winter, showed up at community events. But he was also ruthless when he felt it was necessary. He believed in loyalty above everything else, and he demanded absolute obedience from people who worked for him. Marco's voice was distant, remembering. He loved my mother completely. When she died from cancer when I was 16, something in him hardened. He became colder, more calculating, less interested in the community aspects of what he did and more focused on power and control. That must have been hard on you. It was. I watched him become someone different, someone harder, and I watched how that hardness affected everyone around him. The people who worked for him, the people who owed him, even me. Marco's jaw tightened. He had expectations. I was supposed to follow in his footsteps exactly, no questions, no modifications. When I suggested different approaches, he saw it as disrespect. When I questioned methods, he saw it as weakness. But you weren't weak, Emma observed. You were thinking critically. He didn't see it that way. The last real conversation we had before he died was an argument about exactly this, about whether change was possible, whether we could evolve the family operations into something more legitimate. He told me I was living in a fantasy, that the world didn't work the way I wanted it to. Those are almost exactly the words Vincent used today. I know. Marco's smile was bitter. Vincent learned from the best. He's essentially continuing my father's arguments, using his logic, his worldview. In a way, Vincent is more my father's son than I ever was. Emma reached across the table and touched Marco's hand briefly. A gesture of comfort, nothing more. Your father was wrong. The world works however we make it work. Systems only exist because people maintain them. If enough people decide to change, the system changes. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's possible. You sound very certain about that. I have to be. Because if I don't believe that systems can change, then I have to accept that I'm trapped forever in the debt cycle my father created, that there's no way out, no possibility of something better, and I refuse to accept that. Emma's voice was firm. So yes, I believe change is possible. I have to. Marco studied her face, and Emma saw something shift in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. You're stronger than you think, Emma-chan. So are you, Marco Castellano. The moment was broken by the bell above the door. Emma looked up to see a man entering the diner. Tall, maybe 50, with steel-gray hair and cold eyes that swept the room before landing on their booth. Emma felt Marco tense beside her. Vincent, Marco said quietly. The man approached their booth with measured steps. He glanced at Emma dismissively before focusing entirely on Marco. We need to talk. Privately. Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Emma. Vincent's eyes flicked to her again, this time with more interest. And not the good kind. The waitress? You're confiding in a waitress now? This is what I'm talking about, Marco. You're making decisions based on emotion instead of strategy. Emma, this is Vincent Russo, my father's former associate, Marco said, his voice carefully neutral. Vincent, this is Emma Chen. She's a friend. A friend. Vincent's tone made it clear what he thought of that. You don't have friends in our line of work, Marco. You have allies, employees, and people you need to watch. That's it. That's my father's philosophy, not mine. Your father's philosophy kept this organization strong for 35 years. Your philosophy is going to destroy it in less than 2. Vincent leaned against the booth, his posture casual but his voice sharp. I've been hearing things. People are talking. They're saying you're soft, that you're giving money away instead of collecting it, that you're more interested in playing businessman than being what you actually are. And what am I, Vincent? You're Antonio Castellano's son. You're the head of a family organization that has responsibilities, obligations, and a reputation to maintain. Or at least, you're supposed to be. Emma watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She should excuse herself, give them privacy for what was clearly an internal dispute. But Marco had said she could stay, and something told her that leaving him alone with Vincent right now wouldn't be good. I'm aware of my responsibilities, Marco said, his voice dangerously quiet. What I'm questioning is whether those responsibilities have to be fulfilled the same way they always have been. There's a reason things were done the way they were done. Your father understood that. He understood that respect and fear go together, that people need consequences, that showing weakness invites challenges. Vincent's eyes were hard. You're inviting challenges, Marco, and eventually someone's going to accept that invitation. Is that a threat, Vincent? It's a reality check. You think you can change everything, make us into some kind of legitimate business empire, wash away decades of how things worked. But you can't rewrite history. You can't make people forget what this family is. And you can't protect yourself by being nice. Marco stood, and Emma noticed how he positioned himself slightly between her and Vincent, a subtle protective gesture that she doubted he even realized he was doing. I think we're done here, Vincent. If you have concerns about how I'm running things, you can bring them up at the next meeting, but I'm not going to have this conversation here. Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Of course, we'll discuss it with the others. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your new approach, especially the part where you're taking business advice from a waitress. He left without another word, the bell chiming harshly in his wake. Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He seems pleasant. Marco sat back down, and she could see the tension in every line of his body. He's dangerous. Not just because he disagrees with me, but because he has the experience and connections to actually cause problems. If he decides to move against me, what are you going to do? I don't know yet. I can't remove him. That would be seen as me consolidating power in a way that would make everyone nervous. But I can't let him undermine everything I'm trying to build either. Marco rubbed his face tiredly. This is the impossible balance I'm trying to maintain. Change things enough to make a difference, but not so much that everything collapses. Emma thought about this, about the complex political reality Marco was navigating. It reminded her of her own balancing act with creditors, trying to pay down debt without triggering collection actions, trying to negotiate without showing how desperate she really was. Can I ask you something? She said. Always. Why does it matter so much? Changing the organization, I mean. You could just run things the way your father did. It would be easier, less resistance, fewer challenges to your authority. Why fight so hard for change when it's clearly making your life more difficult? Marco was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the parking lot, the highway beyond, the distant city lights starting to glow as evening approached. Do you remember what you said the first night we met? He finally asked. When you told me not to do it, not to hurt Tommy. I remember. You said violence doesn't fix anything, that it just creates more problems, more pain, that there had to be a better solution. Marco turned to look at her. I've known that my whole life, Emma. I've watched my father's methods create endless cycles of retaliation and revenge. I've seen families destroyed, lives ruined, communities damaged, and I kept thinking, there has to be a better way. There has to be. But knowing something and being able to change it are different things. Exactly. And for years I told myself I'd change things when I got the chance. When my father died and I took over, I thought it would be simple. Just start doing things differently, and everyone would adjust. But it's not simple. Every change I try to make gets pushed back against. Every new approach is questioned. Every attempt to be better is seen as weakness. So why keep trying? Because someone has to. Because if I don't, then everything stays the same forever. The same cycles, the same pain, the same waste of potential. Marco's voice was intense now, passionate in a way Emma hadn't heard before. And because when you stood up that night and said, don't do it, you reminded me that change is possible, that one person having the courage to speak up can shift everything. You changed that situation with Tommy just by being brave enough to say something. If you can do that, maybe I can do this. Emma felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though she couldn't deny that Marco was compelling. It was more like recognition, like meeting someone who understood the same fundamental truths about the world that she did. You're putting a lot of pressure on one moment, she said softly. Maybe, but it was an important moment. For me, at least. Marco smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. You have no idea how many people in my life just go along with whatever I say because of who I am, what my family represents. You didn't know any of that. You just saw a situation and responded with courage and compassion. That's rare, Emma. That's valuable. I'm not sure Vincent would agree. Vincent thinks the only valuable qualities are ruthlessness and loyalty. But he's wrong. The world is changing, and organizations that don't change with it get left behind. I can see that even if he can't. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from the personal to the philosophical. Marco told her more about his attempts to legitimize the family businesses, about the construction company he was trying to grow through honest bidding instead of intimidation, about the restaurants he wanted to make into genuine community gathering places instead of fronts for other activities. Emma shared more about her father's business, about how it had failed not because he wasn't good at what he did, but because he couldn't compete with larger suppliers who had advantages he couldn't match, about how desperation had driven him to make choices that had ultimately destroyed him. He wasn't a bad man, Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. He was just trapped by circumstances, trying to survive in a system that wasn't designed for people like him to succeed. That's what I'm trying to change, Marco said. Systems that trap people, that leave them no good choices. If I can make even a small dent in that, then all of this struggle is worth it. As the evening shift began and other customers started arriving, Emma excused herself to work, but she remained aware of Marco in booth 7, watching him take phone calls and respond to texts with the weight of leadership evident in every gesture. Around 8 o'clock, Danny approached her at the counter. "You're getting too close to him," he said quietly. "We're just talking." "Emma, men like Marco Castellano don't just talk to people. Everything is transactional in their world. Everything." Danny's voice was worried, fatherly. "I've seen this before. They seem charming, they seem genuine, and then suddenly you're in deeper than you realized and there's no easy way out. It's not like that." "Are you sure? Because from where I'm standing, you're spending an awful lot of time with someone who exists in a world you don't understand. And that's dangerous." Emma wanted to argue, but she couldn't entirely dismiss Danny's concerns. He was right that she didn't fully understand Marco's world, right that there were probably aspects of his life and business that she wasn't seeing. But she also believed that Marco was genuinely trying to change, genuinely struggling with the same kind of existential questions about choice and destiny that she faced every day. "I'm being careful," she promised Danny, "but I also think he needs someone who sees him as a person, not just as Antonio Castellano's son or the head of an organization. Everyone in his life wants something from him, or judges him against impossible standards. Maybe just being a friend is enough." Danny didn't look convinced, but he nodded and went back to the kitchen. When Marco finally left around 9 o'clock, he stopped by the counter where Emma was sorting receipts. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening, for understanding, for not judging." "Same to you." "I mean it, Emma. He paused, seeming to search for words. "You're helping me more than you know. Just by being you, by asking questions, by believing change is possible. That matters." After he left, Emma found an envelope tucked under his coffee cup. Inside was a note and a business card. Not his usual card with just a phone number, but an actual business card for Castellano Construction Company, with a name, Sarah Mitchell, HR Director. The note read, "Sarah handles hiring for all our legitimate businesses. If you're serious about getting back into accounting or business consulting, she might have opportunities. No obligations, no strings, just a chance if you want it. Think about it." Emma stared at the card for a long time. Another gesture, another offer of help. Marco insisted there were no strings, no obligations, but Emma couldn't help feeling that with each kindness, each moment of connection, invisible threads were being woven between them. The question was whether those threads were trapping her or simply connecting her to possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. That night, alone in her apartment, Emma researched Castellano Construction Company. It was legitimate, licenses current, contracts public record, employees with standard benefits and protections. If she called Sarah Mitchell, she might actually find a path back to the career she'd abandoned, the dreams she'd shelved. But accepting that opportunity meant accepting help from Marco, meant acknowledging the relationship they were building, meant stepping closer to a world she didn't fully understand. Emma fell asleep with the business card on her nightstand and Marco's words echoing in her head. "Change is possible. I have to believe that." She was starting to believe it too. The question was what that belief would cost her, and whether the price would be worth paying. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. Emma fumbled for her phone, heart pounding, knowing that nothing good happened at this hour. "Emma, it's Marco. Don't go to work today. Stay home. Lock your doors." She sat up, suddenly wide awake. "What's happening?" "Vincent made his move. He's trying to force me out and he knows we've been talking. I can't explain everything right now, but please, stay away from the diner today. I don't want you caught in the middle of this." The line went dead before Emma could respond. She didn't go back to sleep. Instead, she sat in her dark apartment watching the city lights and trying not to imagine what "Vincent made his move" actually meant. At 6 a.m., Danny called. "The diner's closed today," he said, his voice shaken. "Some men came by last night asking questions about you and Marco. I told them you're just a waitress, that whatever they think is happening isn't. But Emma," these weren't friendly questions. Fear crystallized in Emma's chest. She'd known getting close to Marco carried risks, but understanding that abstractly was different from having dangerous men asking about her specifically. Her phone buzzed constantly throughout the morning. Texts from Marco checking that she was safe. Updates that didn't really explain anything. Then, around noon, a longer message. "Vincent thought he could pressure me by threatening people I care about. He was wrong. I've spent 2 years building relationships with people who want change as much as I do, including some in law enforcement who are tired of the old ways. Vincent's been running illegal operations I knew about but was documenting. This morning I handed that evidence over. He's finished. The organization is mine. Completely now. But I've made enemies. Real ones. I'm sorry you got pulled into this." Emma read the message 3 times. Marco had outmaneuvered Vincent without resorting to the violence everyone expected. He'd used strategy, evidence, and cooperation with authorities. Exactly the kind of change he'd talked about wanting to implement. But at what cost? Another text arrived. "Can we meet? Somewhere public. I need to explain everything, and I need to make sure you're truly safe." They met at a coffee shop in the city, far from the diner, far from anywhere connected to Marco's usual world. He looked exhausted, his suit wrinkled, shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. "I'm sorry," were his first words. "I never wanted you involved in this. Vincent saw that we'd become friends, saw that I valued your perspective, and he thought he could use that as leverage. He was going to threaten you to get to me. But he didn't," Emma said quietly, "because you moved first. I had to. The evidence I'd been gathering, Vincent's activities, the illegal operations he was running behind my back while claiming he was following my father's legacy. It was insurance. I didn't want to use it this way, but he forced my hand. Is it over?" Marco's expression was grim. "Vincent's finished. But his allies aren't. I've taken control, but I've also shown that I'm willing to work with authorities, willing to expose our own people if necessary. Some will see that as strength. Others will see it as betrayal." Emma understood what he was saying. Marco had won this battle, but the war for change was far from over. What happens now? Now I proved that my way works, that we can operate legitimately, successfully, without the old methods. That change isn't weakness, it's evolution. He met her eyes. "And I make sure you're protected. I have people watching your building, your route to work. If anyone even looks at you wrong, I'll know." "Marco, I know you value your independence, but please let me do this. Vincent's gone, but until things stabilize, I need to know you're safe." Emma wanted to argue, but she'd seen enough to know this wasn't the time for pride. "Okay, but Marco, thank you for handling this without becoming what everyone expected me to be." Marco's smile was tired but genuine. "You helped me remember why that matters. Your courage, your belief that change is possible. It kept me from taking the easy path." As Emma left the coffee shop that afternoon, she realized something important. She'd been pulled into Marco's world, yes, but he'd also been pulled into hers. They'd influenced each other, changed each other, reminded each other that being better was possible even when it was hard. The question now was what came next. For both of them. 3 months later, the world looked different. Emma Chen walked into the offices of Castellano Construction Company on a crisp January morning, her employee badge clipped to her blazer. Sarah Mitchell had indeed had a position available, junior business consultant, working with small contractors on financial planning and compliance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a step back toward the career Emma had thought she'd lost forever. The remaining debts were manageable now. She had payment plans she could actually maintain, and for the first time in 2 years Emma could breathe without the crushing weight of impossible obligations. She'd even started taking online courses again, rebuilding toward the degree she'd abandoned. Marco had been true to his word. No strings attached. He hadn't asked for anything in return for the job referral, hadn't leveraged her gratitude into obligation. If anything, he'd been scarce lately, busy with the massive undertaking of transforming the family organization into something legitimate. The Crossroads Diner had become a weekly tradition. Every Friday evening, Emma would finish her work and drive out to have dinner there. Danny always greeted her warmly, still protective but less worried now that she was building a stable life, and sometimes Marco would be there too. sitting in booth 7. On this particular Friday, Emma arrived to find Marco already waiting. He looked different from that first night, less guarded, less burdened. The transformation of the Castellano operations was progressing. The construction company was thriving through honest competition. The restaurants had become genuine community spaces. The illegal operations were being systematically dismantled or handed over to authorities. It wasn't easy. Marco had faced resistance, skepticism, and outright hostility from some quarters, but he'd held firm to his vision, and slowly, grudgingly, people were starting to believe change was possible. "You look tired," Emma said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Big week. We just secured a contract for the new civic center through competitive bidding. No favors, no pressure, just the best proposal." Marco's smile was genuine. "It feels good. Different, but good." They ordered Danny's meatloaf for Emma, the Western omelet for Marco, and fell into easy conversation. They talked about Emma's work, about the small business owner she'd helped that week who reminded her of her father, about Marco's latest challenge with former associates who still didn't trust his new direction. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would think," Marco admitted. "Whether he'd be disappointed in how I've changed things or if maybe deep down, he wished he could have made different choices." "I think about my father too," Emma said, "about how he got trapped by circumstances and couldn't find a way out. And I think about how different things might have been if someone had offered him the kind of second chance you gave Tommy. Do you ever hear what happened to him?" "Actually, yes. He sent a letter last month to the diner, addressed to both of us. He's working at his brother-in-law's auto shop in Ohio. His kids are in good schools. He wanted us to know he hasn't forgotten the gift he was given." Marco nodded, something like satisfaction in his expression. "That's what I'm trying to build. A system where people get chances instead of just consequences, where help is available before desperation drives bad decisions." Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then the bell above the door chimed and a young woman walked in, nervous, glancing around like she wasn't sure she belonged there. She approached their booth hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking. "Are you Marco Castellano?" Marco's posture shifted slightly, alert but not defensive. "I am. Can I help you? My name is Jessica Torres. My brother, he borrowed money from someone. Now they're saying he owes 3 times what he borrowed, and if he doesn't pay by Monday, they're going to—" She stopped, tears welling in her eyes. "I heard you might be able to help, that you're different from the others." Emma watched Marco's face, saw the moment of decision. This was what he'd been working toward, building a reputation not as someone to fear, but as someone who helped break cycles instead of perpetuating them. "Sit down," Marco said gently, gesturing to the space beside Emma. "Tell me everything and let's see what we can do." As Jessica poured out her story, her brother's medical bills, the predatory lender, the exponentially growing debt, Emma caught Marco's eye. He smiled at her, a small private smile that acknowledged what they both understood. This was how real change happened. Not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in small moments of choosing compassion over cruelty, help over exploitation. When Jessica finished, Marco pulled out his phone and made a call. Emma listened as he spoke with someone about investigating the lender, about legal options, about resources available for people trapped in predatory lending situations. "We'll handle this," Marco told Jessica. "You and your brother won't face this alone. Give me until Monday." After Jessica left, tearfully grateful, Emma reached across the table and squeezed Marco's hand. "You're doing it. Actually changing things." "We're doing it," Marco corrected. "You reminded me why it matters. You showed me that courage doesn't require power. It just requires the willingness to speak up when it counts. And you showed me that people can change, that cycles can be broken, that hope isn't naive, it's necessary." They finished their meal as the evening settled in around them, 2 people who'd found unexpected friendship in the most unlikely circumstances. They'd both been carrying impossible weights, inherited debts, inherited expectations, inherited patterns that seemed unbreakable, but together they'd discovered something crucial. The heaviest burdens became lighter when shared. Change became possible when someone believed in it enough to try. And sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply have the courage to say, "There has to be a better way." Outside the Crossroads Diner, the neon sign flickered against the darkening sky. Inside booth 7, Emma Chen and Marco Castellano sat talking about the future, about the business Emma wanted to build, about the community Marco wanted to create, about the lives they were both reconstructing from the pieces they'd been given. "This is how I make things right," Marco said quietly, echoing his words from that first night. "One person at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of choosing better over easier." Emma smiled. "And sometimes," she added, "all it takes is someone brave enough to say, 'Don't do it,' and someone wise enough to listen." They raised their coffee cups in a silent toast, to second chances, to courage, to change, and to the unexpected friendships that made impossible things feel possible after all. The end.